I promise I won't try to be super formal because we are recording this. But just so people joining us from the virtual world will be able to at least take home some of the like helpful things we talk about tonight. But I'm Dr. Marvin, and this is Dr. Williams. So we are two of the healthcare providers here at Prairie Health and Wellness. I'm a naturopathic physician. Dr. Williams is a doctor of osteopathic medicine. And I've been with Prairie Health for 10 years, and Dr. Williams is getting ready to celebrate her 3rd anniversary. And so we are going to talk to you guys tonight about nutrition. And like the title implies, 101, we want to go back to the basics. There's so many different diets out there and dietary strategies. And of course, there's so much conflicting information too, right? About like, what's the healthiest thing to eat or what's the best diet to follow? And so time after time when we spend, appointment times with people in the clinic, I often find that, without just a good solid foundation of just some of the basics, it's that much harder to understand maybe like why some of these other dietary strategies are recommended out there. So we're going to keep it super basic. We're not going to really focus on like paleo or gluten-free or dairy-free or those types of things. We're just going to talk about just basic nutritional concepts. And then of course we'll get fun and exciting here towards the end where we'll just, give people different examples of things, kind of point out things to look at. And then like we talked about earlier, the irony of offering candy at a nutrition talk. So all you people at home are missing out on the candy that we're going to hand out at the end of the presentation. So anyways, the other thing that I wanted to mention too, just as we got started, is that what we're also not going to do tonight is focus really heavily on research. While research is really important and has its place, on the flip side, I think we also, for being totally honest, we find that a lot of research in the nutrition world is heavily biased. A lot of research that we see is oftentimes funded by food industries. And so there's a ton of conflict of interest there. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't have its purpose or it's not important, but if anything, what I really want us to try to do this evening is just go back to good old-fashioned common sense, right? And so when we kind of start going through certain things, it's like, while yes, we could totally reference probably a number of different studies that frankly could argue both sides of the equation, I think it's most important that, again, we just learn some of these basic concepts and just go back to like always asking the question of like, but does this make sense from a common sense perspective, right? So, okay, without further ado, I'll let Dr. Williams, she's going to start us off. Sorry, got to talk in so people can hear, but she's going to start us off this evening, and we'll get going.
All right. Hey, guys.
Hi.
So yeah, I'm Dr. Williams. We'll get started. Our first slide here. So nutrition is one of our main, we call them our pillars of health, but they're kind of things that you need to have all of them in place, hold up your overall wellness. Nutrition's obviously a big one. You are what you eat. I really like that because it's true. Everything that you eat, you break down, and then that becomes your body. And so you need to make sure that what you're putting in is good quality food and that it's real food and there's substance to it. It's often said that the skin is the largest organ in the body, and while that's true, technically if we break it down to surface area, the gut lining, so much larger. If you boil it all the way down, if you take the average adult gut lining and spread it out into one flat layer, it's about the size of a tennis court, and it's only about 1 cell layer thick. And so that is one layer of cells between everything you consume and your inside physiology. So the gut is our largest interface by far between the outside world and our internal structures. Right underneath that layer of cells is your bloodstream, your nervous system, 70+% of your immune system. So these are just examples. We won't get too much into gut stuff, but just examples of why what you eat has such a huge impact on your overall health, more so than just nutrition, but all the other components of it can play a major role in things. And I think that's probably where kind of the let food be thy medicine comes from, is you're either putting good stuff in or you're putting bad stuff in. No matter what, it's going to be having some kind of an impact. And if we can aim that impact towards the positive, why not aim for that? So we'll kind of break things down a little bit into, there's macronutrients, and we won't get too much into the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals and things like that. But macros, so we've got our carbs, our proteins, our fats. Those are kind of the common ones that we hear about. So carbohydrates. There's three main types of carbs. You've got your sugars, which are kind of the simplest forms. They're the ones that we can break down really quickly. We can use them and or store them if we've got excess. But these are things like your glucose and your lactose and stuff like that. It's the more common version that we find in a lot of processed foods, and this is what we think of when we hear added sugars on a nutrition label. Next would be your starches. So those are complex carbs. They're essentially chains of those simple sugars kind of all latched together. Takes a little bit more work, a little bit more time to break those down. And so they go a little bit more slowly. You don't get that great big glucose spike. Kind of keeps things a little bit more balanced for you. These are things that are going to be in like vegetables and grains and beans and stuff like that your body just has to process a little bit more. And then lastly in the carb category is fiber, which is, the plant skeleton basically. We don't get a whole lot of nutritional value from that. We can't really break it down and absorb it, but it's still pretty vital. It helps with digestion and helps with feeling full. And then it feeds your microbiome as well. So those are kind of our different factors that we look at when we're talking about carbs. For reference, a gram of carbs has about 4 calories. Next, we'll look at proteins, which similarly, a gram of protein also has 4 calories. Proteins are basically just chains of what's called an amino acid. So we have a big long chain of them, and they can present in all sorts of different patterns and things like that, and then that's how we get to our various different proteins that we have. There's 20 amino acids, and 9 of them are what's called essential amino acids. That means we can't make those ones, so we have to get them through our diet if we're going to get them. When we talk about in foods, a complete protein is a food that contains all 9 of those essential amino acids. So pretty much any animal protein is going to fall into that category. And then a handful of plant-based proteins, so soy and quinoa and things like that, or even if you combine things like a rice and beans combination, kind of counts in that category as well. But it's something to always be cognizant of, especially for more of our plant-based diet people. You have to be a lot more intentional about making sure you're getting in all your different varieties of proteins and all those amino acids that we can't make for ourselves. Also, you can absorb protein a lot better from animal sources than from plant sources. So, lastly, we've got our fats, which have been demonized in the past. I think they're kind of making a comeback a little bit. There's always the trend going around. Fats, and I think this is part of why they were demonized, they have 9 calories per gram. So they're a lot higher calorie food, but that doesn't mean they're bad necessarily, just something to be aware of. And a fun fact that's a not so fun fact, alcohol has 7 calories per gram. So it's closer to fat than to the other two when we're looking at counting calories. Good fats are vital to good health. They make up our cholesterols, which is another thing that's been demonized, unfairly, I might add. Cholesterol is vital. Good fats are vital for that. You need it for your skin, for your brain. Your brain is made up of fats. All of your nerves are coated in fats. It's a very important thing to have. However, there's a lot of bad fats. And a lot of those bad fats are things that were touted as a good thing when fats were being demonized. So this is where we get into the vegetable oils and the seed oils and the margarine instead of butter and all those things. Ugh. Yeah. So they've been heavily processed at, high heats and hydrogenated and all these things that make them no longer really food. They fall more into the chemical category. to where they're going to be inflammatory and they don't provide a whole lot of nutritional value, but they're still giving you all those calories. And so fats in whole foods, so if we're thinking animal foods and nuts and things like that, generally those are going to be fine. It's more when we're looking at the processed foods and the fried foods where they use the cheapest and easiest to get in bulk type fats. When you're cooking at home, we always recommend using either olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, or one of the animal fats. So your lard, tallow, ghee, butter, things like that. Those tend to be the better options for cooking with fats at home. Real life nutrition. A lot of our modern food isn't really food. If you go through the grocery store, everything that's in a package, you have to be really cautious, do a lot of label reading, which we'll kind of get into here in a minute. But a good rule of thumb that I've tried to operate by is think back a couple hundred years, 200 or 300 years ago. If nobody on earth back then would have recognized it as food, probably shouldn't go in your mouth. And that includes ingredients. So if you read an ingredient label and it's just a bunch of chemicals, that's not real food. And I know this can be, kind of a difficult process to go through. Sometimes it's a really big overhaul for people. I usually just go with, start small chunks at a time, build that one into a habit, and then you can move on to the next. I also really like keeping things simple. It doesn't have to be this great, big, complicated process. It's just one step at a time, and then eventually with enough time and repetition, those changes start to feel like the new normal, and it begins to feel as much of a routine as your current diet does now. So it's just kind of a deciding to get started and pick a place to start. And then once that one's done, pick the next place. So next we'll get into reading food labels. There's a lot of deception here. Kristen will get more into that and all the fun stuff there in a minute. But things that we like to focus on here, because they can be sometimes deceptive, sometimes just downright confusing. They've got a lot of information on there, and it's hard to know what's actually important, what to focus on versus what you can ignore or let go. So first thing to look at, you want to look at the serving size, because oftentimes you'll get a bag of chips and some people just eat the whole bag without realizing that there's 3 or 4 servings in that bag, and they're thinking the calories listed are for the whole bag.
I could eat this whole bag.
There's not much in there.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's probably like half full, but it's 6. This bag is technically 6 servings. So.
Yep. So paying attention to the serving size is important, especially when we're doing calorie counting and carbs and macros and things like that. It can actually be, I don't know that I'd call it a fun exercise, but an important exercise to periodically actually measure things out. If a serving size is a cup of whatever, get out your measuring cups. And that way you know exactly how much a cup looks like this versus just kind of measuring with your heart. Sometimes we end up getting a lot more than we think we're getting. And so I'll usually tell people, for a week or 2, just measure everything out, and it gives you a really good idea of what your diet looks like currently. And then that gives you some data points to work with in terms of making some changes going forward. And then periodically check back in with yourself, because if you don't do it for a while, sometimes we forget and we go back to measuring with our heart and, well, I thought it still looked like a cup, but I guess my mindset shifted a little bit on that.
Well, and if we want to sprinkle in like some research with those types of things, the research often and consistently will show that people largely underestimate when they're, providing a diary of sorts of what they eat, and that they often will consistently overestimate how much exercise they do. So, because again, it's like the bias most people know is to, eat less, move more. And so I agree. I think it's a fantastic exercise to occasionally get out those measuring utensils so you can really see what you're doing. One example I always give my patients is with olive oil. I love to use that if I just want to drizzle like a dressing of sorts on a salad. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do this exercise. And as I'm doing what I think is my drizzle in my head, actually was technically several tablespoons of olive oil. And so here I am, eating this like very nutritionally dense salad with protein and all the vegetables and things. And, then at the end of the day, you're kind of like, well, why is my body not responding a certain way that I would expect it to respond? So a lot of times I'll hear that too, where people are like frustrated maybe that they're not losing weight and they're going, I'm eating these really healthy foods. And I'm like, well, the beauty of these really healthy foods is that they're oftentimes very nutritionally dense, right? And so I just wanted to add commentary to that
No,
one
that was
because I think
perfect.
it's super helpful for people.
Yeah.
Do we have any Starbucks people in here that like pump? You guys don't look like Starbucks people to me, which is good. But I did throw this out here just in case, because I know a lot of people do like their Starbucks, and it is pumpkin spice latte season. But when we're talking about, which I know you'll comment on, it's like, oh, look how much sugar is in that 16 ounce, so not even like the big things that people get sometimes.
Yeah.
50 grams of sugar.
Which it adds up fast if you're not paying attention. And most people aren't. So that's where checking in with yourself periodically and just having kind of that intentionality can often be really helpful. So let's see here. I'll go back. Yeah. So looking at the macronutrients, so paying attention to how much protein is in there. I find that sometimes this is one where people have a hard time getting enough protein. And so that can be a piece to pay attention to and be trying to add things up to get up to where you want to be. And then looking at carbs, looking at fat, definitely looking at the added sugar, because that often is more that processed sugar, the simple sugars, that's going to spike your blood sugar level and cause inflammation and things like that. And so trying to go with more of just if it's got some natural carbs in there, some natural sugars, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but just being cognizant of how much. The other piece to look at is the percent daily value. I always take this one with kind of a grain of salt. So mathematically, that percentage is based on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, which oftentimes is going to be more than what a lot of us are doing, especially those of us in this room. It's also based on saying 50 grams of added sugar is the norm. And then it looks at a lot bigger number of carbs than we would expect, a lot lower. It says 50 grams of protein, where typically we're recommending our patients aim for double that. So the percent daily value, there can be some useful information, but sometimes it's a little bit misleading in terms of what your goals actually should be, because it's based on just this average standard American diet. Another key to look at in a lot of foods, and this becomes very difficult, but a lot of foods are fortified with folic acid. So if you see enriched flour and things like that, folic acid is something that a lot of people don't realize, but they have a hard time processing and turning into usable folate. But it's an ingredient in a lot of things, and so it's a piece to also just be cognizant of. I'm trying to limit your intake there. So lastly, we'll get into ingredients, and this is another one where I fall into that kind of simplify approach. Read the ingredient list, aim for things that have as few ingredients as you can find, and they're all things that you recognize. It goes back to the, couple hundred years ago. If you read something on that list and someone 200 years ago would say, what in the world is that? That's probably not real food. It's probably some kind of a preservative or additive, or there's artificial dyes and colors and artificial flavorings, or even if something says natural flavoring, technically they only have to start with the natural source of whatever it was, and then they can do whatever they want and still call it a natural flavor. So just all these little pieces to kind of be cognizant of when you're reading labels. Another factor that we talked about earlier, that Siete brand, I guess were recently purchased by Pepsi. So far the ingredient list still looks good, but it's something that continue to check them, because sometimes people change their formulations. And if you're just going by the brand and you don't know that they change things, that can have an impact on your health as well. So yeah, that would be most of what I've got.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a
you're
great.
up, Kristen.
I think it's a perfect transition. Again, that's why it's like we kind of wanted to keep it light. We didn't want to go like too heavy into like even with macronutrients and micronutrients and some of these dietary strategies. But just like you were starting to mention, I think this is one area that we're starting to pay a little bit more attention to, right? I mean, if you're, I guess as long as your source of information isn't mainstream media, if you've got some independent sources, you'll see like there's some really well-known, respected people that have the credentials to talk about stuff like this, where it's like, when people are eating foods that they think or they've been told that are healthy, 9 times out of 10, especially if it's got a label that looks something like this, you're not really getting food. Like Dr. Williams said earlier, you're getting a ton of chemicals. And so again, if we're going to go back to that, like, let's think critically, that thing called critical thinking that we're not seeing as much of today, you have to question at least and go, is this going to help me or hurt me? Especially if we isolated these chemicals, right? And if we looked at the labeling, like, you go to Lowe's and pick up a bottle of Roundup, there's going to be warning labels on it. But what then we don't make the connection is that, like, the oats over here, so I brought this brand of oats that's certified glyphosate free. And, most of your oats that you'll find in the grocery store, unfortunately, are going to test really high for these levels of chemicals. So I think if we can start really teaching people that they need to be looking at those types of things, you're going to see a major difference. Like, how many of you have either experienced this yourself or you've heard friends and family say it time and time again? When I go to Europe, I can eat, pizza, pasta, all the things, while arguably there could be some other things that contribute to people feeling good while they're in Europe. I'm on vacation. I'm like, in this beautiful area. I'm not working. My stress levels are down. Again, like, I think food is another very obvious thing, because I'm sure many of you guys in this room already know many of the chemical compounds that are allowed in foods in the United States are banned in European countries. Sometimes, the United States as a country, we're even purchasing these banned chemicals from these other countries. So, sometimes I learned this long ago, and again, if I'll sprinkle some research in there, there's research that shows that when we're talking to kids or young adults about nutrition, one of the best ways we can reach them is if we actually talk about the injustices in the system versus just like telling people, like, here's what you eat to be healthy. And even though I like to consider myself a young person, I am no longer 18 or 20 or, but I will tell you that is one thing that majorly motivates me to, when I'm out shopping and I'm voting with my dollar, right? I'm definitely thinking about these companies who frankly do not care about you or me. They care about their shareholders and their pocketbooks. Okay, I'll also stay off a soapbox. But everybody likes it, right? Everybody agrees. Everybody's smiling and nodding, right? So, kind of along the lines of these, just, how it's difficult and can be complicated sometimes to learn how to read labels. It's not always the nutrition facts or the ingredients label that swindles people. Sometimes it's just the marketing that's on the front of the package. So like, this is actually a picture that I took from a family member's home where I was visiting, and I was like, oh, these look interesting, because they were tortillas that you cook. So they weren't just like ready to eat. So I was like, oh, so there's kind of, you can see there's like bright colors, ready to cook. It kind of, when something's like, when you need to take an extra step to do it, it kind of does give like a little message of like, oh, maybe this is different. Maybe this is like a little healthier. Even at the top right-hand corner, you can see it says no preservatives added. But when I flipped over and read the ingredient label, I mean, you can see so when Dr. Williams just mentioned like the folic acid, sometimes you'll see that labeled as enriched vitamins. And again, like a lot of these vitamins, they're synthetic. They aren't metabolized well by most of us anyways. And so, but because they're they're using the word, oftentimes you'll see vitamin in there, or vitamins that a lot of people recognize. Sometimes that's another kind of communication that these companies use to people to kind of imply that it's healthier, right? But you get through like a lot of these. I mean, there's the word hydrogenated, of course, seed oils, but BHA and propyl gallate, which most people are like, what's that? Those are actually preservatives. So companies apparently can just flat out lie on some of their packaging too. So that's why I think if we just go back to the basics of learning how to read through an ingredient label, you can ignore some of these, misleading things that you'll see on these packaged foods. Another example, Dr. Williams highlighted the importance of protein. And so, of course, companies pick up on stuff like that. And so on these Nature Valley bars where they're saying, hey, these are, high in protein, first of all, even if we just reflect back to what you talked about with like percent daily value, even just looking at the grams of protein, 10 grams of protein, not a super, high protein number if you ask us. But even then, it's like, look at the protein source. So again, like going back and going, what are the ingredients in this? And of course, it's a bunch of junk. I mean, it's a bunch of vegetable oils, corn syrup, fructose. That's the other thing when you're like looking through. It's like, well, how many forms of sugar do we have to put in something? And frankly, I think one of the main reasons why they do it is because these are addictive substances. And so, again, like the whole point for these food companies is they want you to come back and buy more. So if you want a book recommendation, there's a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss, I think. I always want to say Michael Moore because of the film guy, but I'm pretty sure it's Michael Moss. Salt, Sugar, Fat. So that's an investigative journalism piece where they, he goes in and interviews and talks to a lot of these big food industry, like corporations, and they actually hire scientists to formulate these foods, sometimes even down to like the shape of the molecule and how it hits our taste receptors in our mouth to, again, make us want to go back and buy more. So I don't know about you guys, but that kind of stuff makes me angry. And if we're going back to that kind of like injustice piece, sometimes that's something that can really speak to people too. But just some examples here of how this can be, misleading and more conflicting messages. The labels obviously never end. And I'm not saying that all of them are not helpful. I think there are a few that arguably can be at least a starting point. But again, at the end of the day, like if you can really learn to read the ingredients of like the example of like I even mentioned with those tortillas of like, I can just look, if I see the word hydrogenated, I'm putting it back. I don't care what else is in it. I don't even care what it is. Even if it's something that I really arguably needed for a recipe, I just know at the end of the day, what's really important to me and for my family too, is like what Dr. Williams talked about initially of all that's going in my body. And so, also that, I love that quote, like we sacrifice our health at the altar of convenience. Pay for it now or pay for it later, right? So, and then also too of just talk about being misleading. So there's a lot of things that food industry can get away with if the ingredient contains or the product contains less than a certain amount of something. So like trans fat, which we all know is not good for our body. Many processed foods, if there's less than 500 milligrams, can actually claim that they have 0 trans fat or that they're trans fat free. So again, too, I think just learning concepts of like, while processed foods, yes, arguably are very convenient, I mean, pretty much 10 out of 10. It's hard to make an argument for how that's going to help us from a health perspective, right? So other things that honestly can be confusing, especially like, I listed some things here as like free range, cage free, like you'll see this with eggs, right? So one of our guests here like brought up, what, are we going to talk about like connecting with a farmer? Absolutely. Like highly recommend. I'll admit my conflict of interest. I am a farmer. But I still connect with other farmers that, maybe I'm not raising a certain animal myself. And obviously there's lots of benefits. We'll kind of get into some of that here in a slide or two. But at the store, it's like you're trying to buy eggs and, you'll see free range or cage free. And while those things are yet like arguably good things, I mean, free range technically just means that they like have access to the outdoors, but it could be, a space this big and it may not be they have access all the time. Mm-hmm. Or like cage free, they may not be tucked in a cage, but they're still in this large enclosed barn and they may not have access to outdoors. Same thing you'll see, unfortunately, even with like grass fed. It may be grass-fed for part of its life, but then it's grain-finished, right? So that's why even when you go to farmers markets, even when you network with a farmer, you still want to ask these questions. You never want to assume. We have great farmers markets here in Wichita, actually, and people are great. Like, you can chat them up. I chat them up all the time. And maybe sometimes they don't love some of the questions I ask.
I'm sure you're very thorough.
I'm very nice, though.
Oh, yeah.
I will throw that in there. And, beautiful, like this was last year, but beautiful farm stand, beautiful produce. Little too beautiful. And again, super nice people. We had a great conversation, but it really was like a humbling reminder that there's still at farmers markets people using chemicals to raise their produce. And as a farmer, and I should say a novice gardener, I know it can be tough to grow food that looks really good because there are the elements that sometimes are really hard to fight against. But there's several natural things that can be done. That's probably for another talk, though.
Yeah.
So, and non-GMO, again, you guys look like super smart people in this room, but non-GMO just means that the food is not a genetically modified organism. They still often will spray all kinds of chemicals and things on non-GMO items. So again, that's where some of that labeling can be misleading. So another thing, obstacle I know that comes up for a lot of people is just the cost of food. But really, if you look at some of the numbers, I really think convenience is what's expensive. You know, when you're making most of your meals at home, on average, that can look like about $4 a meal versus fast food. And of course, everything's more expensive these days, right? But I mean, like, it's crazy how much money you can spend even at a fast food restaurant, and you're getting junk, you know? And then even a relatively inexpensive restaurant, you're looking at least $15 a meal. So, you know, honestly, you really do save more money. Even though, yeah, like maybe feels a little like you're spending more because when you go to the store, you oftentimes bring that food home and then spend time preparing it instead of it just like being ready to go. But I thought this was interesting. You know, on average, the American family of 5 spends anywhere from just under $800 to over $2,000 a month on what would be considered like a moderate grocery plan. How do you guys budget for groceries every month or food? I highly recommend it. Maybe I'm a weirdo and I just like numbers, but I will tell you, there's something like very, what's the word I want to use? Just very fulfilling when I know what I'm feeding my family of 4, and we eat 95+% of our meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, anything in between of stuff at home. And knowing what I do that at and then comparing it to like what that would look like if I was eating out or grabbing fast food feels really good. And obviously you get the benefit too of like a healthy family. So I try to, you know, speak of that highly because again, like, you know, earlier slide of like, let's give this the respect it deserves. You have to eat food to live. A lot of people live to eat, but we need to treat it like we have to eat to live, right? And so oftentimes when we're working with patients in the office and we're going through those pillars of health, oftentimes just the busy schedules, busy lives, you know, food, it's crazy how food just gets, you know, pushed to the side when it's that important. So just a few quick tips of like think about buying in bulk. You know, certainly sometimes planning meals can be very helpful for people. I like to try to teach and encourage people, like when you can learn how to really like stock your either pantry or refrigerator and then learn how to like easily and relatively quickly make some just like staple meals. This is how, I mean, you can really fine tune this and it feels good. So things to buy in bulk, certainly meat, and this is where we highlight find a local farmer. There's several around. You certainly can start at farmers markets. We're big fans of Jayco Farm in Hutchinson. Born-Traeger Farm's another one. They're in Hutchinson. But it doesn't have to be this operation. I mean, it can really be, you know, people like my husband and I that are just small families that live a certain lifestyle, and We happen to have more pigs or more sheep or more cows than my family can eat. So sometimes it's finding a person like that even. Social media, of course, use that. You certainly can just throw out a random post, and before you know it, 12 of your friends know somebody they can recommend to you. So it's not hard to find. You just have to put a little effort into looking. And then you can build that into your monthly budget. So for example, if you buy a quarter beef at roughly $1,000, divided by 52 weeks in a year, maybe it ends up being about $20 a week or about $80 a month, and you can build that into your budget. And then you can quickly see, like, I mean, that's gonna, for the most part, feed a family of 4 in a year, assuming that maybe you're buying some other cuts of meat too, assuming that's not like your only source. But things like oats, rice, pasta, some of the grains that haven't been heavily processed, certainly things like nuts and seeds, and even some of your dairy items you can often buy in bulk. So I just made like a quick list of these are really common things I even keep in my pantry or freezer, because when I look at these things, I know I can quickly come up with a variety of different meal ideas. So even, all-purpose flour, or even just plain cane or brown sugar. While, we certainly don't make that a staple in our diet, right? Sometimes that stuff pops up. And I think, again, like, how gluten and dairy and even sugar has become demonized. I think probably what like the true demon in those equations is like some of the chemicals and how things are processed, like we talked about. But if you're buying like an organic, all-purpose, even flour, or some of these ancient type grains, right, like kamut, or what's the other really popular one? Einkorn, things like that. Again, you can quickly like make your own sourdough bread or make your own, like pie type pastry that you can quickly throw together, like a chicken pot pie or something like that. Like these things don't have to be complicated. And then, we have some other examples up here too. I'm gonna walk and try not to tear things out or over. So some of these pastas, are you guys familiar? Like, have you guys seen some of these before? This is, you can pass it around. I actually get these at Costco of all places. And, back to the whole, like, everybody knows somebody who's been to Italy or some European country. Some of that stuff's imported. It's imported. Like this brand here, this is imported from Italy. And if you look at the ingredient label, all it says is organic durum wheat semolina. None of the enriched stuff, nothing else, right? And so, you can make obviously a ton of more nutrient dense, less inflammatory, versions of these types of things. Here's the oats. Like, is everybody familiar with this brand too? So like organic, but certified glyphosate free. Again, this is another Costco find. And then here's another one sometimes that sneaks up on people, nuts, when you're buying nuts and seeds, right? You're like, oh, okay, this is a healthy snack. Flip it over and read the label. Thankfully, this is a good one. It's macadamia nuts and sea salt. 9 times out of 10 though, like if you're just at your, run-of-the-mill grocery store, even at Costco too, these are a Costco find, but like even at Costco, a lot of their nuts and seeds, you flip it over and it's like soybean oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil. And do you guys all know how seed oils are made? Is everybody familiar with that process? Heat. They definitely use heat, which often oxidizes these oils, right? Because they can't withstand high cooking temperatures. And then they have to use some kind of pressurized system to squeeze the oil out of the seed. And when they do that, combined with the heat, it turns into this disgusting looking, smelling sludge. Well, they can't sell that and put that in food. So what do they have to do? They have to bleach it and deodorize it. And oftentimes, like I've looked into this a little bit, like with some of the organic seed oils, and it seems like for some, at least that I was able to find, they have more regulation on like they can't, with the bleaching agent, it has to be more natural, not chemical based, so it's like, even I think you'll find in maybe some of these, so I'll send this around because we are going to let you guys sample these if you want to. Like one of I had to put it in the cute little Halloween basket. But I think one of those in there, if you look at the label, there's like an organic sunflower oil. And, it's like, this is where it's about balance, right? It's like, do I buy these things and bring them in my home all the time? No way. Palm Yeah. And I think palm oil is an interesting one. I think if it's just palm oil, it's the fruit, but I think there is like a palm kernel or like palm seed or something oil. So like avocado oil, some people think, oh, well, isn't it from this big seed inside the avocado? It's actually from the flesh. Same with coconut, right? So some of those can get a little confusing where you're like, is this a seed oil? Even like peanut oil, it's, technically peanuts are legumes, so not technically a seed, but I digress. So again, it's like, I think some of the excuses I hear are like, hey, this is too hard, or, it's too hard to make a change. I left a grocery cart of food in the middle of a store once because I was so overwhelmed. And this was long, long ago when I was on starting my journey. And because it is, so I validate people. I'm like, it is hard, and there is a learning curve. But you know what's harder? Is that 1 in 2.5 children have a chronic illness. 50% of Americans are pre-diabetic or diabetes. Having chronic disease and illness, that's hard. Like either just saying no or trying to find like some better alternatives, it's not hard. Perspective is helpful sometimes. And I'm humbled by that daily. I often find myself having pity parties, and then I'm humbly reminded of like some of this other stuff can be hard. So this is actually a real life example from my family, just real quickly. I just have this list of several things. This is what I even spent on a recent Costco trip. That's my sweet little almost 4-year-old. I spent $580, and I just go once a month, because $580, that's a lot of money, but that allows me to have all these staples of things, several pounds of whether it's, some of the dairy stuff like cheddar cheese that I use in a gazillion things, or butter, or even like these are great when we're trying to help people, get good amount of protein. So this Safe Catch tuna brand, the Safe Catch part is indicating that every tuna is mercury tested. Because have y'all ever seen a tuna fish in the wild? It's freaking massive. It's a huge fish. So those big predator fish eat all the tinier fish, and that's the thought process behind why they become concentrated with mercury. So it's, instead of just saying, well, I'm not going to eat any tuna, it's nice that you can find brands like this now. But one of these 5-ounce cans has 43 grams of protein in it.
Is that a Costco?
This is a Costco find, but I think you can get this brand in and this is not expensive. This is like $13 for this whole thing. Yes. So even if you don't have a large family, technically I don't have a large family. I just have, I have 2 kids. But yeah, you can still, I think, really actually budget well and find yourself spending less money. And then, for the weekly trips that I'll make for just some of the fresher produce type things that go, bad fast type of thing, or we arguably just eat quickly, it's like I make those trips and I maybe on average spend about $100 a week on top of that. So for a family of 4, again, that's eating most of our meals at home, it's really, at most we're maybe spending $250 a week on food, and we eat really well and we're not hungry, how privileged it's, again, sometimes goes back to that perspective thing.
What are you finding for cheese? Because I was wondering about cheese.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean just as far as like quality goes?
The brand or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Besides Kraft.
Yep. Yeah, I know. I always used to think like Kraft and some of those things are just like fake cheese, right? Which there's definitely a lot of processed fake stuff in there. But I looked at one the other day just out of curiosity, and I was like, oh, it actually had milk in it. I still wouldn't buy it, but I was like, hey, at least it had milk in it, Or like Velveeta, I'm always like, what even is that? I don't know. But yeah, sometimes it's a balance. My budget, it does not allow me to buy 100% organic or 100% raw. I mean, I try to do the best I can. And so while sometimes I can find some organic cheeses, like at a place like Costco, or sometimes maybe I can fit into my budget, I go out to one of my farms, or like my neighbor has dairy goats and he sent me home with some, cheese that he had made recently, which was great. So it's, I think it's about balance. But even like, so this cheddar cheese that I bought at Costco, technically not organic. But when I read the ingredient label, thankfully, there's nothing crazy in there. So it's kind of a balance thing, right? So, and sometimes you got to be like with shredded cheese, like there's technically some bags of shredded mozzarella cheese in there. Same type of thing. It's like looking for any like additives or anti-caking agents or those types of things. So, so again, it's like balance. It's like do the best we can. Because I tell you what, I tell my patients this all the time. I'm like, I'd much rather you eat fruits and vegetables, even if it's not organic, because maybe it's a cost, a financial obstacle, versus a package of Twinkies. Or like those god-awful, sorry, not sorry, Nature's Valley protein bars that I showed on the previous slide. Much rather my patient eat a conventionally grown apple, for example, or a banana or whatever. You know what I mean? So yeah, sometimes that can be challenging, but, and then I just listed several meals that we'll often make from that grocery haul. So, like Dr. Williams said earlier, keep it simple, right? Like don't, like dinner doesn't have to be several courses, and it doesn't have to be like this, some people are just so used to like, okay, I've got to have this, and I've got to have a meat and a starch, and it's like, well, that's okay. But I'm like, well, then keep it simple. Like, I gave some other examples here just for the sake of time of like, like steak, potatoes, broccoli, or pork chop, sweet potato, green beans, or even like salmon salad, sourdough. Like, okay, you can kind of do like a meat, vegetable, starch type of thing. But again, just like keeping it real, keeping it simple, and then take advantage of your crock pot and Instapot type stuff, right? And there's, recipes galore. If you guys are patients at our clinic, you can message your provider, and we've got lots of like digital handout type documents that we can upload into your portal, where there's like crock pot meals, for example. And obviously when we started building out these resources, we're keeping them real food based, right? So, it's like think about stuff like that too. Oh, hold on. We're to the fun part now. But maybe just one quickly, another thing that I think is really helpful. I saw this somewhere recently and I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Sometimes we have all the good ingredients, we have the best of intentions, and then it's like, oh, my ground beef's in the freezer, it's still frozen. And so like once a week, make it like a Sunday ritual or whatever, go pull out several things, and, you can buy these kind of like plastic type storage containers and stick them in your fridge, and you can just put your stuff in that so it's defrosting throughout the week. So you can quickly grab it, and I can still make a healthy real food type meal even when I get home, 6:00 in the evening after I've been in the clinic all day. Okay, so to be mindful of time, we're almost to 7:00. It's the holidays. I call it the terrible triad. You would. You're just never fun. You naturopath who doesn't want to do it. I know. Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas.
New Year's.
I know. I'm like, I'd keep going. We call it the terrible, however many, New Year's, Valentine's, and then you get into St. Patrick's and then Easter. I mean, obviously those aren't terrible things. Of course, I'm going to celebrate Easter, but it's just the candy thing, right? And just the sweets and the desserts and the get-togethers. So this is where it's like balance, right? Finding balance. So for all you fine folks that came out tonight, if you'd like to take a treat, you can.
It's mine.
I know. I sent this box around. This has like some really delicious dark chocolate peanut butter cups. And then you've got like a gummy type candy in there. You've got one that's kind of like supposed to mimic Skittles, which I teach my kids. I'm like, Skittles has poison in it, like literally poison. I can't remember what exactly. Do you guys remember what that is? It the tiny? Yeah. So my kid's the weirdo that's like, my mom said that has poison in it to her friends. That's how I know I'm doing a good job. But again, it's like, do I keep this stuff at home all the time? No. But can we still, I still tell people, I'm like, food can be enjoyable. You can still enjoy some of these holidays and family get-togethers. Before we moved out to our farm, we used to live in College Hill. So for you Wichita people, that's like super popular Halloween trick-or-treating. And, of course, especially just with my knowledge base and what I do for a living, I'm like dying inside. I'm like, I cannot hand out this toxic garbage to these kids. And my husband's like, oh, here we go, Debbie Downer. Here we go. And so I'm sharing this because this really happened. So we decided to have a contest one year, trick-or-treating. So I said, okay, I'm going to buy my thing. And I think what I ended up buying, and I got it at Costco too, so it was reasonably priced, big old box of these organic gummy type, like fruit snack type things. But at least they didn't have high fructose corn syrup, they didn't have artificial colors or flavors. And I was like, we're going to have a table. And I'm going to set my bowl here, and you're going to set your bowl here. That had like the traditional Snickers and Skittles and all that god-awful stuff. And I said, let's see. Let's see who runs out first. I did. The organic, gummy, fruit snack type thing. Now, granted, kids really like fruit snacks, so maybe I was cheating a little bit. But I thought it was interesting because we still had the brand name, recognizable stuff. So I think, sometimes you'll be surprised by kids. Like kids are super smart, and we do not give them enough credit. So, and as you can tell, like the point of sharing this, if you wanted to try it, was just for people to see that like, hey, this stuff, it's accessible. You don't have to like specialty order it online. And I think frankly, it tastes better, truly. So, and think about too, like non-food items. But Thanksgiving desserts, is an option. It's like, you can swap sweeteners, maple syrup, honey, that type of thing. Or like I just made a pumpkin dump cake this week for a colleague's birthday, brought it to the office, and it called for like 1.5 cups of sugar. I'm like, that's a lot of sugar. So I just cut the sugar basically in half and still made the recipe the same. So it's like, it tasted amazing. People loved it. And it wasn't like, I didn't really use these like healthier alternatives. So I think the key when you're sharing things at events and stuff is just don't draw attention to it. And when you do that, you will have people come up and be like, I need the recipe for this, So don't be afraid to do that. I try to encourage people to do that often. Experiment, and then like whipped cream. Oh my gosh! If you please tell me you guys make your whipped cream just from whipped cream. You will never go back to Cool Whip or any of those other things. You literally just buy heavy whipping cream and use a little hand mixer or stand mixer, whatever. Be patient and maybe throw in, if you want to sweeten it, you don't have to. It tastes good enough on its own. You want to dump in just a little drizzle of honey, maple syrup, a little bit of vanilla extract even. You will not go back. My 16-year-old, well, I guess he's 17 now, nephew, last Thanksgiving, he was ready to just take the bowl and run. He's like, what is this? I'm like, it's just literally the simplest thing, So, and even, Christmas stuff. I've bought these candy canes before. So again, they technically are sugar, but they don't have artificial red number 40 that's been linked with all kinds of god-awful conditions. And so you can find this stuff and you can learn how to do it and you can still really enjoy it and it can be fun. So you guys are awesome. Thank you for coming.